Good morning, everybody. So it's true that we don't have the absolute newsiest panel that we could, but I will also confess that the five of us are extremely relieved. Because the decision would have come out about 45 minutes ago, and we were joking whether we should just get up and each read different parts of the decision. Because we certainly would not have had time to have read it beforehand and say anything intelligent about it. So I actually think the timing here is really nice, which is we can help frame some of these issues, and at some point, almost certainly this week, we're going to get a decision in this case, and I hope we've helped you think about it going forward. I've moderated a lot of panels here at Aspen. We are all extremely lucky to have this panel today. It's just a fantastic group of folks, and I'm really excited to get going with the conversation. So, Jeannie, I want to start with you. In some Supreme Court cases, and I would argue that last year's Dobbs was one of them, it's kind of the binary decision is 95% of what matters. Which way are they going to go? It seems to me this is a little bit different. We have a pretty strong sense that they're going to go generally in one direction, but exactly how they do it is deeply uncertain and will have huge effects for policy. So can you help us understand, and then I'll invite everyone else to jump in as well, can you help us understand what are some of the big questions you're looking for beyond yes or no?
Yes. Okay. So we do expect that the Supreme Court will eliminate the permissibility of affirmative action. And so then how will they do that? So here are the things I'm looking for. First of all, as you know, the case was brought by a group representing the interests of Asian American students. And it's both the North Carolina case and the Harvard case. The plaintiffs are Asian American students. So what does that mean for this decision? Well, the Supreme Court can certainly eliminate affirmative action and say that that can no longer be used without really saying very much about the fact that the plaintiffs are Asian American. It could have been anyone who challenged it, saying that the policy was inherently discriminatory toward other races that were not being given a plus for race. And so the Asian American race of the particular plaintiffs here really could be treated as a little bit beside the point. But there is also a possibility that the actual claim made by the Asian American plaintiffs here in the Harvard case in particular, which was that Harvard intentionally discriminated against Asian Americans, which is, you know, for a lot of people it's difficult to understand, but those are separate claims. The idea that affirmative action is unconstitutional and unlawful is one claim. But there's a separate, distinct claim that was made in the Harvard case and was litigated in full in the trial court, which is Harvard actively discriminated against Asian American applicants in favor of white applicants. And the entire trial was about that Asian-white comparison. So therefore, you can have a decision getting rid of affirmative action that either says nothing about the Asian discrimination claim or says something and says, actually, the district court got it wrong when they said that Asian Americans were not discriminated against in favor of white applicants. And so I think those are two separate parts of the decision that I'll be looking for, because you can see the permutations. They can be combined in different ways.
And just one more beat on that. Let's say they said that there is discrimination against Asian Americans. Let's say the court said that. What's one way in which that could plausibly affect admissions going forward?
It could affect admissions in a huge way, in that right now, if you have no consideration of racial composition of the class, let's say that's what has to happen, right? You can still, in that world, have a situation where Harvard did a bunch of things, like use a rating called the personal rating, in which Asians were given the lowest personal ratings of any group, including white applicants, right? That you can keep using that and not really think anything of it, right? Getting rid of affirmative action will not affect whether you can keep doing that and giving a certain group the lowest ratings on these very discretionary and qualitative assessments.
You're saying the personal ratings are on their face race neutral,
they are.
But in practice
they are race neutral. And so in practice, the allegation was that Harvard was using these personal ratings to reduce the population of Asians in their enrollment. And so there, if the court says nothing about that, Harvard gets to say there has no court, including the Supreme Court, that said that we discriminated. All the court said was that we can't use affirmative action, which is just the court changing its mind, and we just did everything right, and we just now, and we've just been told that we didn't discriminate against Asian Americans. So Harvard could accurately say that if the Supreme Court doesn't touch that issue.
Mm-hmm. Imani, I know you've thought a lot about the parents involved decision from, 2007?
Yes.
And so one thing I'm going to be looking for in this decision, in 2007, it's a K through 12 case, parents involved. Mm-hmm. My understanding of it is that Justice Kennedy said that it is okay to use race-neutral factors to achieve racial diversity.
Right.
So that you can think about wealth, you can think about other things, and then you can kind of look afterwards and see whether you're getting racial diversity from these race-neutral factors. To me, one of the big questions is, does this court say you can no longer use race-neutral factors and think about racial diversity, basically undoing parents involved? Do you think that's, am I asking the right question there, and how are you thinking about it?
Right. I mean, I think parents involved is complicated because one of the consequences, however, was that Seattle could no longer, this is a situation in which the effort was not, and it's not a classic affirmative action case, but the effort wasn't to advantage or disadvantage people in an applicant pool. It's actually to achieve racial diversity as a goal, right? And they actually limited the way that Seattle could do that. And if you combine that with a prohibition on affirmative action, potentially you have a consequence in which the court ultimately serves to limit the efforts at any form of remediation of the problem of both segregation and inequality in this country, right? So that you can't try, if you can neither address the problem of deep segregation in public education, nor can you try to address the consequences of that in higher education, you actually you have no remediation potential whatsoever, right? And the question, and I think it's, we'll see in another one of the cases that'll be coming out this week, the answer to the question of whether sort of having diversity as an end is acceptable at all. But if that isn't the case, if the court says that's not the case either, we're going to actually have a large social crisis which extends far beyond the question of education.
So you've heard three things here to look for in addition to which way the case goes. What does the court say specifically about this issue of discrimination against Asian Americans? What does the court say about whether diversity is a worthwhile goal? Until now,
right.
The court has said, diversity is a vital goal for our country and it is legal to do things to get diversity. And then the third thing is what will they say, which is related to diversity, but it's a little different. The third thing is what will they say about using race-neutral means to achieve racial diversity.
Right.
So, Richard, you've gotten a lot of attention. Some newspaper based in New York, maybe the New York Times, wrote a big front page profile of you, and you've sort of become known as the liberal who is against race-based affirmative action. Can you, whether you reject that label or not, can you talk to us about what your concerns are about the status quo?
Yes. So I didn't like the headline, which had me against affirmative action. I'm very much for affirmative action. I think it should be based on economic disadvantage as a way of producing racial and economic diversity. The problem right now is that places like Harvard seek racial diversity, which is fabulous. It's a majority-minority institution, and they also have 15 times as many rich students as low-income students. So they have moved away from a system of aristocracy based on race and privilege, but they still have a version of multiracial aristocracy. Now that works well for me and my kids and my grandkids. It may work well for many of the people in this room, but it doesn't work well for working class people who are effectively shut out of these elite institutions. And that matters because our leadership class comes disproportionately from those groups. So if I'm hoping a conservative Supreme Court decision that strikes down the use of race will actually lead to a liberal result, which is that institutions transform the way they do admissions, get rid of legacy preferences, get rid of preferences for fencing and squash, the types of things that are used now to bring in wealthy students, get rid of, I'm sorry, my colleagues here, but faculty children preferences, which are a big deal at these institutions, and instead give a meaningful break to working class students of all races.
We're going to come back to exactly this. I want to bring Sarah in.
Yeah.
I also want to mention one thing, which is Richard's absolutely right that squash and sailing and fencing give a lot of privileges to a lot of upper income kids. But I think people don't realize quite the extent to which nearly all sports now give preferences to upper income kids. The exceptions, and maybe the only two, are football and basketball. Soccer, those teams where there are enormous preferences for admissions relative to grades and test scores. Baseball, softball, because of the rise of travel sports, because of inequality in our country, those sports are also overwhelmingly or disproportionately upper income. And so these huge athletic programs, and at some colleges, at Williams College, one of the best liberal arts colleges in the country, with apologies to anyone who went to Amherst here, Williams College, about 40% of all current undergraduates are recruited athletes. And I'm sorry to pick on Williams, but because it's an excellent school and it's small, it's one of the places where the percentages are highest. At many of these schools, athletes are a huge part of what's going on. And so Richard just gave a list: athlete preferences, legacy preferences, donor preferences, faculty preferences. Those are not just on the margins. That is a very large part of the student body. So, Sarah, you are in a state, you are a dean of admissions at University of Michigan. You are in a state that to some extent we're all headed toward the future where you have been, because by law, Michigan, like California, like Florida, cannot use race in admissions. Can you talk to us about what that is like, and where are we headed where you already are?
Right, so for the last 15 years, Michigan is one of 9 states that can't take race into account in admissions, has been in a natural experiment to see what happens when that is the case. So Michigan does not have preferences for legacy. The University of Michigan. Michigan has, in the last 15 years, increased its admissions and financial aid preferences for low-income families. So, and the result is where we are heading, which is, with all respect for Richard's point of view on this, it is much whiter and more Asian. There will be many fewer students of color in our nation's universities. So I have some numbers written down so I wouldn't get it wrong. So at the University of Michigan undergrad, which I'm going to use undergrad numbers because the law school is very small, and so the numbers are just not as illustrative. In the last 15 years, the number of African Americans in the undergrad population have decreased by 44%. Number of Native Americans have decreased by 90%. So the number of African Americans on a campus is 3.9% at Michigan, and the number of Native Americans in a state which has a pretty significant Native American population is effectively 0. It's tiny. So, and in case you think this is just Michigan doing it wrong, our UCLA and Berkeley, which are very similarly situated and have been race blind for 25 years, the number of African Americans on those campuses are 3.2% for UCLA and 2% for Berkeley. So I looked at, there's only about 120 undergraduate schools in the country where race is a factor in admissions. But as Richard mentioned, these schools have an outside role to play in our economy and in the futures of the people who attend them. So it's a small group, but it's extremely significant. So I looked at a group of 14 significant, all the Ivy Leagues, Stanford, and then some of the biggest non-race blind public institutions. So it was a combined population of undergrads of 340,000, okay, currently. If we apply the Michigan experience to those schools, we should expect to see 44,000 fewer Hispanic, Black, and Native American students in 4 years, 44,000 fewer, and 7,500 fewer African Americans. So it would be, for African Americans, the overall percentage of those schools would drop from 5.4%, which is not a huge number to begin with, to 3.2%. And the number of underrepresented minorities, as the common terminology, would drop from 34% to 24%. So, to my mind, this is an extremely dramatic outcome.
Richard, I promise we'll come back to you, but I know, Imani, that you, yeah, please.
Can I interject? Because I want to personalize this for a moment, because I think these numbers are really important. But I want to talk about this for a moment in the context of my own life. So I descend from people who were enslaved in the United States in the colonial period. So we have we have slavery, we have short period of Reconstruction, redemption, Jim Crow. The country finally becomes modestly open 1968, 4 years before I was born. I'm a beneficiary of affirmative action. I'm a proud beneficiary of affirmative action. By the time I was 8 years old, all the other efforts at remediation of the history of American discrimination had faced an enormous backlash, right? So it's the only thing that's left. Only remediation for that history that's left. My children now are told, well, probably, that they've been given too much, so that they can't benefit from affirmative action, right? So we're talking about hundreds of years of history, one generation gone.
Right.
And I think that we have to frame it in that way, because when we frame it, we have to have a historic frame, because when we frame it simply in terms of kind of present actors, even if you take into account the depth of inequality, which is extraordinary, right? And the depth of inequality across class, and I'll say it, and I'll make this point dramatically, Trayvon Martin didn't come from a low-income community, right? Jordan Davis didn't come from a low-income community, right? So that there's pervasive racial discrimination that coexists with pervasive class discrimination that is racialized. And affirmative action has been a necessary but wholly insufficient remedy. And that is actually on the chopping block today. And that's the nation that we live in.
Jeannie.
Yeah, so for many of us, it is the idea of a descendant, someone who is descended from slavery, and someone who is African American. Those are coterminous. But it is interestingly the case also that there has been some discourse, and even in the Supreme Court oral argument in the fall on this case, that seems to have some openness to separating out these things. For us, that may sound very formalistic, but I think for a conservative Supreme Court to say, considering whether someone has been descended from slavery is different from considering race, their skin color in itself. And there was, I think, some potential in the oral argument to do something like that. I'm not optimistic, however, because I think many conservatives who care about this issue would think that those two are one and the same. But I think that there's some, to the extent that race-neutral alternatives are the key going forward, can it be a race-neutral method to say we're going to remediate based on past disadvantage, including slavery? I think that that could be understood as a race-neutral alternative by some people, by not others. But it goes all the way back to 1978 when Justice Powell in Bakke, to me, this was the original sin of affirmative action, which is that he ruled out the idea that you could consider past enslavement and disadvantage in this way, and said the only compelling interest here is student body diversity. Those are very different things, whether you're going to have a diverse group of people or you're actually going to take responsibility for the fact that the country has had this history of enslavement and subordination of a particular group. And I think that if we move toward the subordination model somehow after this decision, and I think perhaps Richard also thinks that the class angle might be one way to do it, I think that we don't have to think that this is a completely dead project.
There was a fascinating moment in the case, and I actually listened to all 5 hours, and I realized this is a very nerdy thing to say. I highly recommend it. If you've run out of podcasts, listen to the 5 hours of the arguments in affirmative action. And it's not just because of how important this issue is. These 9 Supreme Court justices are enormously important figures in our national life, and they sort of try to hide behind this mystical shroud, and listening to all 9 of them talk in the way that we often hear presidents and senators talk is just a really useful thing to do as a citizen. And one of the striking parts, it's exactly what Jeannie just alluded to, Justice Kavanaugh specifically said, isn't it true that if we took into account whether someone is the descendant of enslaved people, that is race neutral, right? There is legislative history in this country, right? We're not saying what race are you, we're saying, are you the descendant of someone who's enslaved? You can think of it in a mathematical sense as removing race from both sides of the equation, right? And so I think that's just a really interesting debate. I know you want to talk about the University of California. Can I just ask, can we just spend 1 minute on one other thing before we get into the University of California? So given this history that Imani just sketched out, not just enslavement, right, but much more recent housing policies, what about the argument, and I'm asking Richard, but anyone can weigh in on this, what about the argument that we have constructed affirmative action wrong and that it should be specifically targeted at the two groups that have been the subject of most government discrimination, which are Black Americans and Native Americans, and we have conflated it, and that race-based affirmative action, in order to ameliorate those unfairness, is a legitimate policy, but we have messed it up by including a lot of immigrant groups. And when you actually look at the data, Latino Americans and Asian Americans are climbing the American economic ladder at roughly similar rates to Italian Americans and Irish Americans in early generations. And I understand many people would disagree with what I'm spelling out. I'm not saying, but it seems to me that there is an argument to be made that we do not have we have a problem with anti-Semitism in our country. No one's arguing that we should have affirmative action for Jewish students, and that we should extend that to other groups, and it should be reserved specifically for Black Americans and Native Americans, given how bad the past discrimination is and how large the gaps have been since the 70s. Can I just ask you and anyone else to weigh in on that? And then I promise we'll get to, I know your view of class-specific programs is more positive than Sarah's. I promise we'll get there.
Yes, okay, great. Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and I think I agree with Imani and others that it would have been so much more powerful if the original rationale for affirmative action, the remedial rationale, was front and center in the Supreme Court, and instead we got diverted into diversity, which can benefit lots of groups. And when I was testifying in the case, the dean at Harvard said that he was going to advocate for legacy preferences as a way of promoting diversity. And his argument was people who've had more experience with Harvard and those who've had less experience with Harvard will interact with each other and learn from one another and become better citizen leaders because of the diversity that legacy preferences bring. So it's an amoral idea that loses all the powerful force that comes from looking at our history. I mean, we have to address our history of race in this country. The question is, I think going forward, the practical question will be, are there ways to structure race-neutral alternatives, things like preferences based on class, that reflect that history? And I would point to two things that I think in particular will benefit African Americans. One is to consider the wealth of applicants. A low wealth applicant has less opportunity in America. And precisely because of our history of slavery, segregation, and redlining, the black-white wealth gap is much, much bigger than the black-white income gap. That's something I wish University of Michigan had looked at in its admissions policy. The only place that I know of that does that is UCLA Law School, and I think it's an important way of reflecting history. So I do have comments on
We'll get there.
Michigan and California, but I'll hold off on that.
Sarah, what do you think about this idea that we're drawing the line in the wrong way, and that these programs should be focused on Black Americans and Native Americans?
I mean, I think that's a very compelling argument to be making. I mean, I've certainly seen in my experience in admissions at the law school that these are two groups that are relatively steady in the sense of over the almost 25 years that I've been doing this, that the population in the application pool and the relative credentials is pretty consistent, whereas Asian Americans and Latino Americans have changed enormously over that time. And to me, that really is an indication of our history.
The only, modification that I think is really important is to disaggregate Latinos and into,
That's
right, so I think it's really important to
and Asian
include Puerto
Americans, too.
Ricans, right, and Asian Americans too, but
Absolutely.
But to include Puerto Ricans and people who experience a kind of an indigenous form of discrimination, but also in people of indigenous origin amongst Latinos, particularly in the Southwest. It's hard to sort of, they may not be classified as Native American, but they functionally are, right, for example, so.
Yeah.
And I should thank you for that. I should be clear that the data that I was talking about was really about immigrants, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so the data on immigrants continues to look extremely good. That doesn't guarantee it'll still look good 30 years from now. But if you want to read the social science on this, I would recommend a book called Streets of Gold, which takes advantage of the huge digital revolution to look. It uses tax filings from the last few decades. It uses census records from past generations. And it really tries to look at mobility across different immigrant groups. And at a time when we hear so much negative stuff about the outcomes for today's immigrants, the social science research also just offers a much more positive lesson. But that is not the same as people who've been in this country for generations and often have been the victims of redlining, including many Latino people as well. Before we dive into California, Jeannie, do you want to add anything to this? You kicked us off on it.
I guess another thing I would be looking out for is diversity. What is just as Clarence Thomas, I think in the oral argument, we heard in the preview that he said, I have no idea what diversity means, and there was a bit of a chuckle. But, there is a way to cut diversity in different parts. There's the schools often, Harvard, they always say, it's about diversity in all its forms, in many, many forms. Diversity, not just racial, but all kinds of diversity. And racial is just one slice of the kind of diversity we're looking for. But the more you de-emphasize the role that racial diversity plays in the seeking out of diversity in general, that kind of waters down what it is schools are supposed to be doing. I think it's going to hurt them in the end, because if they specifically said, this is about racial diversity, then I think that they would have had a better case that what they needed to do was consider each applicant's race in order to achieve racial diversity, and that the narrow tailoring, for the lawyers here, the narrow tailoring between the means used and the ends would have been more clear. As it is, if you say it's just regular diversity, all kinds of diversity, whether you play a musical instrument or you're from the Southwest or whatever, it's all mixed in, then it makes it seem like, well, why do you need to use race in particular to consider applicants? So I think that the Supreme Court is going to knock out the compelling interest of racial diversity, but they're not going to knock out the idea that you can seek diversity in all its forms, and that's going to be interesting, because the schools will then have to navigate, how do we show that we want diversity in all its forms without specifically saying we want racial diversity?
So California is another state where they have not had race-based affirmative action by law for more than 20 years now. And the share of black students at Berkeley dropped quite sharply after that and has remained quite low. And that has gotten a lot of attention. It got a lot of attention in the oral arguments. Now, the numbers that I've seen, the most recent numbers I've seen for UCLA and for the other UCs is, with the exception of Berkeley, UCLA, which is highly competitive, now has more black students than it did before race-based affirmative action is banned. The entire UC system has more black students than it did before race-based affirmative action was banned. They have vastly more Asian and Latino students. So Richard, I know you think of California actually as a kind of a success for class-based affirmative action, potentially, or a partial one. Can you talk about that? And then I welcome anyone to talk about what concerns they see from California.
Yes. So California, you may all have read about what happened after California stopped using race. And in the amicus briefs, the UC system said it's been a disaster. We've had huge declines in black and Latino representation. We've spent $500 million and nothing worked. At the same time, their admissions offices at UCLA and UC Berkeley in recent years have noted that they have admitted the most diverse classes in more than 30 years. So there's a disconnect between what you see in the amicus briefs and what you see in in the data and in what the admissions offices are talking about. So I think California has been successful, and I'm glad you pointed out UCLA in particular has been more successful than UC Berkeley. And when you think about the levels of racial diversities at these institutions, it's remarkable that they have done as well as they have, given that they are fighting and competing for talented Black and Hispanic students on an unlevel playing field. So if you get into Berkeley and you're African American or Hispanic, and you get in without a consideration of race, you are most likely also to get into Stanford, because Stanford, even though it may have somewhat higher admissions requirements, does consider race in admissions. So where are you going to go? This is not the experience at Michigan, at the University of California, is not necessarily indicative of what will happen nationally when everyone is on the same playing field.
Richard, how do you think, to the extent that some UCs have been successful, how do you think they've done it?
Well, they've done a number of different things. I mean, one is they have a version of the percentage plan where if you're at the top of your high school class, that's part of what's considered. Their system is not as good as Texas's, where they've been much more successful in using a percentage plan to get racial diversity. But they do have that. They look at factors like whether you grew up in a disadvantaged community, because that matters a lot. Middle class African Americans, because of race discrimination in the housing market, tend to live in more disadvantaged neighborhoods than poor white people. Mm-hmm. So if there are ways using economic measures to get at racial disadvantage in America. And so if you look at income, that's not going to be fair to Black and Hispanic students by itself. But the UC system looks at whether you grew up in a neighborhood with concentrated poverty, and that's helpful in the process as well.
So I think both Sarah and Imani, I think Richard is imagining a system where we take into account not just the family wealth, but neighborhood wealth, in which we take into account these top 10% plans, which many people like. If you're one of the best students at your high school, you can come here, which is sort of removing segregation from both sides of the equation. And I think there is this idea that if we did that, we could have more diverse classes. My sense is that you both are more skeptical that could actually work. Sarah?
I just want to say one thing about top 10% plans. It does not remove segregation from the equation. In fact, it maybe even reifies it, right? The one reason Michigan has never seriously considered a top 10% plan is because it is a state with a vast amount of segregation. So it would not achieve, you'll have several school systems that are minority-majority, but mostly they're majority white. So it won't work.
So help me understand that. My understanding is part of what Texas did is because there is segregation, because there are high schools that are overwhelmingly Latino in Texas, high schools that are overwhelmingly white, high schools that are overwhelmingly Black, a plan that admits just the top students from each high school achieves some diversity.
It was a combination of Michigan as a whiter state than Texas, and the fact that the segregation, I think, is more complete. It's just a limited number of schools, a very small number of schools. And then it also, that only privileges one measure of merit, which I think is a conversation we probably won't have time to get into up here. What does it mean to have merit in a country that is so historically unmeritorious? But I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought.
No, that's fine.
This is really important. And I would add that effectively what top 10% plans do is they incentivize sustaining segregation.
Yes.
We don't want integrated schools before you get to college, right? And then what happens in state systems is and Texas is an example, is where do the students of color, which of the schools they wind up going to? Disproportionately, they're not at Austin in significant numbers, right? And so you actually, they structure sustaining segregation as the only possible remedy.
Right. I remember the last point I wanted to make is also
Yes.
it just is privileging just GPA over all
the
other
other measures,
forms
right.
of everything, right? And I understand there is a fairly deep skepticism about the good faith of admissions officers, and Operation Varsity Blues didn't help with that. But admissions officers that I know and truly want to create classes that have a range of characteristics in them, and if you're just saying it's a very mechanical cutoff, it's a very different undertaking than we've ever seen.
And the last thing I want to say on this point, that if you're ever in public high schools in low-income communities, there's often stratification within those schools that's either ethnic or racialized, right? So that even majority minority schools tend to have racial stratification within them. And so again, you don't actually address the problem in that way.
If I could say one thing on the percentage plan, we haven't talked about politics yet, and we have to deal with the reality that, according to Pew, 74% of Americans do not want race considered in admissions. I'm not part of that 74%. There are certain circumstances where I want race in there. So remember that when I talk to elite audiences, I think it's always important to remember that there is a much larger public out there that is deeply, deeply skeptical. And that's why it's important to look at some of the alternatives. And in Texas, there was a beautiful coalition of working class white leaders and working class Black and Hispanic leaders who came together to fight for that 10% plan. I mean, the civil rights group were strongly supportive of the top 10% plan because it is a way to produce racial diversity in a way that is accepted by the broader public. And the people who are fighting against the top 10% plan are, in essence, wealthy white suburbs who lost out. They had something of a monopoly on UT Austin. And suddenly you had kids coming from working class communities in rural parts of the state, working class communities in urban parts of the state. And if you look at the data on who gets in through the top 10% plan in Texas, about 3/4 of the class gets in through that metric, and the other quarter get in through discretionary admissions that include race. The socioeconomic profile and the racial profile of those who get in the top 10% is much, much more diverse than those who get in through the consideration of race plus all the other things that university admissions officers like to consider that tend to privilege the most economically advantaged students.
And I would just add, if you doubt any one poll result, the poll results Richard just cited are consistent with the election outcomes in places like California, where even in California, race-based admissions lost at the ballot box. I want to look toward the future now in two different ways. So even though the details are going to be very important, as I sketched out at the beginning, let's imagine the decision ends up in some broad place that we imagine. Imani, you've made clear that's a decision you'd very much lament, right?
But I've been anticipating it for a long time.
What's the path forward after that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I am less, to be honest, invested in focusing so much on affirmative action once the court my investment, and this is, I think, to Richard's point, I think is a political question for our elected officials, but it's also a question for people in the private sector, which is, okay, then if one believes in the principle of a multiracial democracy, then what happens, right? And I think for me, the point becomes that we then shift our focus from this tiny group of elite schools, although I do think state institutions occupy a particular role because they are supposed to serve the entire state, and focus on resources on where the kids are, where people are, right? You can make any institution an excellent institution. And there needs to be a deep investment. And this is part of the problems that we're in a moment in which public institutions are experiencing disinvestment. But there has to be a more robust investment in those institutions that actually serve the nation broadly. I also think there has to be an investment, and I think this is both for Black communities, but also the larger society in historically Black colleges and universities. They're the institutions that sustained a legacy of excellence when the society was wholly closed, and a society closes again, they have to be reinvested in. It's the only sector of higher education which has seen increased applications in recent years, and it's partially because of the backlash against social progress around race that kids are turning to HBCUs, but also anticipation of what is likely to come this week.
I mean, the University of Michigan, which is one of our greatest institutions of any kind, is starved for resources, and yet, relative to community colleges and HBCUs and commuter four-year schools, they are much more starved for resources.
100%, 100%. I mean, I do think, I read a statistic that said more than half of K-12 schools are either 75% or more white or 75% or more non-white. The 75% or more white schools get $2,200 more per student in funding than the other schools. You know, that's where we should be investing. This is, as I said at the beginning, this is a very small number of institutions that are affected by this. They're very important. If it goes away, we really have to get down to the fundamentals.
And can I just say something else really quickly? Because I think it's important, the investment is not just, since we're in this context, is not just giving scholarships and jobs to people at these underfunded institutions. The institutions have to be funded as places that can produce excellence.
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
I completely agree with what you're saying, Imani, that, you know, community colleges in this country are the institutions for the aspiring middle class. And these students often have the greatest needs, and we invest the least money
in them. Yes.
In those people's. And while we're in a moment of harmony, Sarah, I'll agree with you too, that you know, we need to do more to invest in schools that are segregated, but more importantly, to take steps to integrate those schools. And there are tools available. There are now 171 school districts and charter schools that look at the socioeconomic status of students as a way of maneuvering through the parents involved decision that prohibits the use of race to bring about some measure of racial diversity. But I also don't want to let these elite institutions off the hook. They matter, and there are so many things that they could be doing that they're not. You know, getting rid of, for one thing, non-need merit aid. I mean, this is money that is going to students in order to attract, you know, high-scoring students who will make you look better on U.S. News and World Report. But the kids don't need the money. Why are we wasting money on those types of programs? We ought to be doing that, and the federal government ought to be investing much more too.
And just to connect two dots here, the University of California schools on economic terms are amazingly diverse. I mean, a third of their students receive Pell Grants, which means they come from lower to lower middle income families. By comparison, at some public schools like the University of Virginia, the number's been around 10%, right? So the University of California are really models of diversity. One of the ways they achieve that is they admit a lot of community college transfers. And I think that's another thing that's sort of worth looking at. It does not solve the bigger problem that Imani was talking about, but it can still be part of it. Jeannie, take us to the future. You just had a piece in the New Yorker. Tell us why, as my colleague Adam Liptak at the time says, this is not going to be the last affirmative action case. Tell us why we're all going to be talking about TJ going forward.
TJ is a high school in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson, and it's a selective high school that draws from middle schools, and it's a combination of different kinds of application methods. And they changed their application method in 2020. And essentially, it resulted in a drop from 70% Asian to 54% Asian. And what they did was they did some version of the 10% plan. It's not 10%, but the idea was middle schools all over Virginia or in these counties weren't sending a bunch of kids to TJ, and so they basically allocated slots that could be filled by a whole bunch of middle schools. Now, Asian Americans were concentrated at some of the most competitive, most high-scoring middle schools, because the parents had flocked the children there because they wanted their children to be at these feeder middle schools. So what that meant is if you spread out, you know, the distribution to all these middle schools, then you get a drop. And so TJ is interesting because what they went to is a race-neutral method, right? They didn't consider race, and when they went to a race-neutral method, the idea was, we don't consider race, so why would this be considered discriminatory? Asian Americans brought a lawsuit saying it was. And I think this is the future in that if you set out to create a race-neutral way of admitting students, but you have in mind that what you're trying to create is diversity, including racial diversity, right? If you have that motivation, but you're using a race-neutral method, now clearly that's what's going to happen with colleges and universities. I think Sarah can attest that just because the Supreme Court says that you can't consider race, doesn't mean you stop caring about race, about racial diversity.
That's exactly right. I mean, the Big Ten schools just put out a statement saying we still care about racial diversity.
So if that's the case, are the schools setting themselves up for another ruling in the future that says, well, you did this race-neutral thing in order to accomplish racial diversity, and therefore that violates the law?
And Jeannie, help us understand, is it all about motivation? Or do the plaintiffs in this case say that the metrics and the standards they were using were somehow unfair?
It was all about motivation. And there is a line of legal doctrine in the equal protection area that says, if you can show that there was a racial purpose, like a discriminatory purpose, then that is discriminatory, right? And it's illegal. But if you can only show that it was a disparate impact, not intended, then it's not racial discrimination according to the constitutional standards. So these cases have been really bad for civil rights activists and people who care about civil rights because you can't always show a purpose. You can always show, many times in these cases, a disparate impact. And so that's, I think, where the discourse is going to move legally. Are these schools engaging in these acts with a racial purpose?
And one of the things that's so fascinating about your New Yorker piece is you pointed out that conservatives end up making historically liberal arguments, and liberals end up making historically conservative.
Exactly.
Okay, just a couple quick pieces of business. Imani, you're giving a book talk today, is that right?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. What time tomorrow?
I wish I knew.
Well, look it up in the app.
It's in the app.
Imani is the most recent winner of the National Book Award for her book South in America. These Wicked Problem, this is the first year the festival has done it. I think it's accomplished just exactly what the Institute and NBC wants, which is given people things to talk about all day, because you can know other people were there. So I encourage you all to continue this conversation over the course of today. Tomorrow in this space at 9, they've got guns. Thursday, they've got immigration. Friday, they're talking about China. Please join me in thanking our panelists.